Daniel Cole hasn't had a hot meal in 3 days. Under the 3rd Street overpass, rain soaks through a jacket that stopped keeping anything out a long time ago. 12 years ago, this man carried a rifle through Kandahar and other men's lives on his shoulders. Tonight, he carries nothing but a folded blanket, a photograph sealed in plastic, and $11 hidden in his sock. His entire fortune, saved one hungry hour at a time. Then, on a sidewalk outside a glass office tower, he sees it, a wallet, leather, heavy, monogrammed in gold. He opens it with hands that haven't held this much hope in years, and inside is more cash than he's touched in 3 years combined. Credit cards, an address in the kind of neighborhood he hasn't walked through since he had a house of his own. This wallet could end everything he's suffering. A warm bed instead of concrete, real food instead of gas station scraps, new boots without holes, a locked door between him and the cold for the first time in 3 winters. Nobody saw him pick it up. Nobody would ever know. Across town, Margaret Whitfield realizes her wallet is gone, and her whole body goes cold in a way that has nothing to do with the money. Because it's not just cash in there. It's the only photograph she has left of her son. A young soldier smiling beside a Humvee, dog tags catching the light, a face she has already buried once and cannot bear to lose a second time. 18 months since she got the phone call. 18 months of pretending she's fine in board meetings while she falls apart alone at night. That wallet is the closest thing she has to holding him again. If it's gone for good, she doesn't just lose money. She loses the last physical proof that he existed at all. What neither of them knows yet is that the boy in that photograph already connects them, has connected them for 12 years, since a chaotic afternoon beside a river neither of them has ever spoken about out loud. 2 strangers, 1 wallet, and a truth about to surface that neither is prepared for. So here's the question sitting at the center of this story. Does Daniel Cole hand over $11 in his sock, a hunger that's become almost unbearable, and a fresh chance at a life he lost 3 years ago, for a stranger he'll never see again? Or does he walk away, disappear into the city, and let a grieving mother lose every last piece of her son she has left? One choice rebuilds his life. The other could break her forever. To understand how a man who once bled for his country ended up with no food, no home, and no one looking twice at him on the street, and what he finally decides to do when dignity and desperation are pulling him in opposite directions, you're going to want to see how this ends. Hit subscribe, like, and share this story so you don't miss his final decision. Comment where you're watching from. And be honest. If you were Daniel, standing on that sidewalk with $11 to your name, would you keep the wallet, or would you give it back? Drop your answer below. Now, going back to how it began. Late October rain hit Harrisburg the way it always did. Thin, cold, and unforgiving. Under the 3rd Street overpass, Daniel Cole sat with a cardboard sign propped against his knee, its ink long since bled into the cardboard by weeks of weather. 12 years ago, this same man carried a rifle through the mountains of Kandahar. Tonight, he carried a backpack, a wool blanket, and 1 photograph sealed in plastic against the rain. Cars rushed past without slowing. Nobody looked twice at the torn jacket, the tired eyes. The world had stopped seeing him years ago. He hadn't stopped seeing himself. 3 years ago, none of this existed. Daniel had a house with a green door, a wife who left the porch light burning for him every night, a job at the hardware store, a pension check that arrived like clockwork. Life made sense. Then the nightmares came back. Worse this time, dragging him to a dusty road where his best friend never got up. Sleep stopped first. Words stopped next. His wife held on as long as grief and silence allowed 2 people to hold on to each other. Within a year, the house was gone. The job was gone. Only the memories stayed. He never really begged. He offered something smaller, a nod, a story, a joke about the weather to anyone who slowed down long enough to catch it. Most people didn't. Eyes on phones, minds on schedules, they walked past without a glance. Daniel understood that better than anyone. He used to be one of them, assuming the men on curbs had earned their place there. He knew differently now. Bad luck doesn't check resumes before it arrives. It doesn't ask permission before it rearranges a life. That lesson came to Daniel the hardest way a person can learn anything, by living it. Every morning, Daniel folded his blanket the way his drill sergeant once demanded, corners sharp, edges even. Some habits refuse to leave, even when everything else does. He'd wash his face at the gas station sink 2 blocks down, comb what was left of his hair, and straighten his shoulders before facing the day. Dignity, he'd decided long ago, was the one thing homelessness couldn't take, unless he handed it over himself. People stared. People whispered. Daniel kept walking, spine straight. He'd survived worse than judgment. He'd survived war. A stranger's shame was nothing next to that. Daniel knew this city's rhythm by heart now. The same joggers at dawn. The same bakery owner who slipped him a roll when she thought no one noticed. The same bus hissing to a stop on 5th and Main every day at noon like clockwork. He caught things most people missed. A kid waving through a car window. A stranger holding a door 2 extra seconds. Just because. Small moments, rare ones. But Daniel collected them anyway, the way other men collected coins. Proof, however thin, that the world hadn't gone entirely cold. Proof he still had a reason to look for it. On this particular Tuesday, the wind cut sideways through the underpass, rattling the plastic bags Daniel used to keep his belongings dry. His stomach ached with a hunger that had become familiar, almost tolerable, the way pain becomes tolerable if it never truly leaves. He had $11 folded into his sock, saved for 3 days, enough for a hot meal if he was careful. He thought about the diner on Chestnut Street, the way steam rose off their coffee, the way the waitress sometimes called him sir instead of looking through him. Small mercies. He was grateful for those. He rose slowly, joints protesting the way they always did after a night on concrete, and began the walk toward downtown, where the sidewalks were wider and the buildings taller, where men in suits moved like they owned the pavement beneath them. Daniel kept close to the wall, out of habit more than necessity, a soldier's instinct that never fully retired. The morning crowd thickened near the financial district. Businessmen with briefcases, women in heels clicking against concrete, none of them aware that a man who once bled for their freedom now walked silently among them, unseen and unspoken to. Near the corner of Market and 4th stood the Whitfield building, glass and steel rising 40 stories into the gray sky, home to one of the city's largest financial firms. Daniel had passed it 100 times without a second glance. It meant nothing to him, just another monument to a world that had moved on without him. He did not know, could not have known, that inside those walls a woman named Margaret Whitfield was preparing for the hardest meeting of her professional life, distracted, exhausted, and about to make a mistake that would change 2 lives forever. Margaret Whitfield was 58 years old, sharp-eyed, and known throughout the company for her precision. She ran the Whitfield Foundation with the same discipline her father had instilled in her decades earlier. But precision had cracked in recent years, ever since the framed photograph on her office wall became the only version of her son she had left. She rushed out of a taxi that morning, briefcase in one hand, phone in the other, her mind consumed by grief she rarely allowed herself to feel in daylight. She did not notice her wallet slipping from her open coat pocket. It landed near the curb, brown leather against gray concrete, camera close enough to catch the moment yet utterly missed by every passerby rushing toward their own mornings. Margaret disappeared through the revolving doors without a backward glance. The wallet lay there for nearly 6 minutes, stepped around, stepped over, ignored by a dozen pairs of expensive shoes. Then Daniel Cole rounded the corner, his eyes trained low from years of scanning sidewalks for anything useful. A coin, a cigarette butt, a discarded sandwich. What he found instead would test every principle he had left standing. He bent down slowly, his knees aching, and lifted the wallet from the pavement. It was heavier than it looked, stitched from fine leather, monogrammed with initials in gold thread. Daniel opened it carefully, the way a man opens something that clearly belongs to someone else. Inside were crisp bills, more cash than he had held in 3 years combined, credit cards, a driver's license bearing the name Margaret Ann Whitfield, and photographs tucked behind clear plastic sleeves. One photograph in particular made his breath catch, a young man in desert fatigues, smiling beside a Humvee, dog tags around his neck. Daniel stared at the photograph for a long moment, something tightening in his chest that he could not immediately name. The young man's face seemed familiar, though he could not place why. He closed the wallet and looked around instinctively, half expecting someone to appear and claim it, half expecting the moment to dissolve, like so many strange coincidences did in a busy city. No one came. The crowd kept moving, indifferent to the small drama unfolding at their feet. Daniel tucked the wallet inside his jacket and stood there, rain beginning again, uncertain of what he was supposed to do next. $11 in his sock, perhaps $800 in his hands, belonging to a stranger. The math was not complicated, and hunger has a way of making dishonesty sound reasonable, even righteous, even deserved. Daniel had gone 2 days without a proper meal. He thought of the diner, of a hot plate of eggs, of shoes without holes in the soles. He thought, too, of the man he used to be, the one who carried wounded soldiers through gunfire without hesitation, who believed a person's word meant something, even when no one was watching to confirm it. He looked again at the license inside the wallet. Margaret Ann Whitfield, an address on Crestline Avenue, the kind of neighborhood Daniel had not walked through in years, where hedges were trimmed into perfect rectangles and driveways held cars worth more than most houses. He could return it there, or he could walk away and never think of it again. Nobody would know, nobody would ask. But Daniel Cole had learned long ago that some decisions are not really decisions at all, not when a man has already decided, deep down, exactly who he intends to remain. Daniel walked 12 blocks before his legs began protesting, the wallet tucked against his ribs like something dangerous, like something that might explode if handled carelessly. He passed a bakery, the smell of fresh bread curling into the cold air, and his stomach twisted painfully. He could buy something small, he told himself, just enough to keep walking and still return the rest. But even that felt like theft dressed in convenient language. He kept his hands in his pockets and kept moving, past the temptation, past the ache, toward an address he had memorized after a single glance. The neighborhood changed gradually. Then all at once, the cracked sidewalks of downtown giving way to smooth pavement lined with maple trees just beginning to shed their leaves. Daniel felt eyes on him before he saw anyone. The particular attention strangers give a man who does not belong somewhere. A woman walking a small dog crossed to the opposite side of the street. A man trimming hedges paused his shears and watched him pass. Daniel kept his head level and his pace steady. He had faced worse than suspicion. He had faced men trying to kill him. Judgment, by comparison, was survivable. Number 214 Crestline Avenue was a colonial-style house with white columns and dark green shutters, the kind of home featured in magazines about gracious living. Daniel stood at the end of the driveway for a moment, wallet in hand, questioning whether this was wisdom or foolishness. Then he walked forward and rang the bell, the sound echoing faintly beyond the heavy oak door. Nothing happened for nearly a minute. He almost turned to leave. Then the door opened, and a housekeeper in her 50s looked at him with the wary caution most people reserved for men who looked like Daniel. "Can I help you?" she asked, her hand still resting on the doorframe, ready to close it if necessary. Daniel held up the wallet, keeping a respectful distance. "I found this near Market Street this morning. It belongs to a Margaret Whitfield. This is her address on the license." The housekeeper's expression shifted from suspicion to surprise, her eyes moving from the wallet to Daniel's face and back again. "Mrs. Whitfield isn't home right now," she said slowly. "She's still at the office. Would you like to leave it with me?" Daniel hesitated, then nodded, extending his hand. Just as the housekeeper reached for the wallet, a car pulled into the driveway behind Daniel, tires crunching against gravel. Margaret Whitfield stepped out, phone pressed to her ear, still mid-conversation about quarterly reports and board approvals. She stopped abruptly when she saw a stranger standing at her front door, a man in a worn jacket holding something familiar in his outstretched hand. Her eyes dropped to the leather wallet, then widened with recognition. She ended the call without finishing her sentence, and walked forward slowly, her heels silent against the wet grass beside the driveway. "That's mine," Margaret said, her voice caught somewhere between disbelief and caution. Daniel nodded and held it out further. "Found it on the sidewalk near your building. Everything should still be inside. I only looked long enough to find your address." Margaret took the wallet carefully, opening it with trembling fingers, counting the bills without meaning to, an old instinct from years of guarding against carelessness. It was all there, every dollar, every card, untouched. She looked up at Daniel with an expression he recognized instantly, the particular confusion of someone encountering honesty where they expected none at all. "You walked all this way to return it," Margaret said. Not quite a question, more an attempt to understand a stranger's motive. Daniel shrugged slightly. "Seemed like the right thing to do, ma'am." She studied him more closely now, noticing the weathered lines around his eyes, the careful way he stood, shoulders straight despite obvious exhaustion. Something about his posture felt oddly familiar, though she could not place why. "Would you like to come inside?" she offered. "At least let me make you something hot to eat, after everything you've done." Daniel hesitated, unused to invitations that asked nothing in return. He almost refused out of pride, the same pride that had kept him standing straight through 3 winters on the street. But something in Margaret's voice sounded less like charity and more like genuine gratitude, and his stomach, empty since the previous morning, made the decision easier than his mind wanted to admit. "I wouldn't want to impose," he said quietly. Margaret shook her head firmly. "You return nearly $1,000 to a stranger. The least I can offer is a warm meal. Please." Daniel followed her inside, wiping his boots carefully on the mat before entering. The kitchen was warm and smelled of cinnamon, sunlight pouring through wide windows despite the gray weather outside. Margaret gestured toward a chair at the island counter while she moved efficiently, pulling ingredients from the refrigerator, her earlier exhaustion replaced by something closer to purpose. Daniel sat carefully, aware of how out of place he looked against the polished granite and gleaming appliances. He noticed a framed photograph on the counter, the same young man from the wallet, smiling in his uniform. Something tugged again at the edges of his memory, familiar and unplaceable, like a name on the tip of his tongue. "My son," Margaret said, following his gaze while she cracked eggs into a bowl. "David, he served for 6 years." Her voice thinned slightly on his name, the way voices do when grief has not fully settled into acceptance. Daniel's chest tightened, the photograph pulling at something buried deep, a memory half-formed and refusing to surface completely. "Where did he serve?" Daniel asked carefully, though part of him already suspected the answer, already felt the ground shifting beneath a conversation that had begun as simple kindness and was quickly becoming something far more significant than either of them yet understood. "Afghanistan," Margaret answered, sliding a plate of eggs and toast toward him. "Kandahar province, mostly. He was there for 2 tours. Daniel's hands stilled over the fork. Kandahar. The word landed like a stone dropped into still water, rings spreading outward through memories he had spent years trying to bury. He had served there too, as a combat medic, patching wounds under fire, carrying men who could not carry themselves. The coincidence felt too large to be coincidence at all. "I was stationed there myself," Daniel said slowly, 2011 through 2013. Margaret's hand paused above the counter. "What unit?" Margaret asked, her voice suddenly sharper, urgency replacing casual curiosity. Daniel told her, watching her face carefully as recognition flickered somewhere behind her eyes. She set down the dish towel she had been holding and reached for her phone, scrolling quickly through old photographs, the kind parents save without fully understanding why until years later. She turned the screen toward Daniel, and his breath caught entirely. It was the same young man, older here, standing beside 2 other soldiers in dusty fatigues, one of them unmistakably, impossibly, Daniel himself, 12 years younger, and smiling despite everything. The kitchen went quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator. Margaret stared at the photograph, then at Daniel, then back again, her mind struggling to reconcile the exhausted, weathered man before her with the confident young medic frozen in a photograph from another lifetime. "You knew David," she said, not as a question, but as a realization crashing into place. Daniel nodded slowly, memories surfacing now in fragments too vivid to stop. A dusty checkpoint, gunfire echoing off canyon walls, a young private bleeding from a wound that should have been fatal, and Daniel's hands working desperately to save him. "I remember him," Daniel said quietly, his voice rough with an emotion he had not expected to feel again. "Private Whitfield. Everybody called him Whit." Margaret's eyes filled instantly. tears she had been holding back for years, finally finding permission to fall. Before we continue, look at Margaret's tears for a moment. Those aren't just tears of grief, they're tears of gratitude. Tears for a man who chose honesty when he had every reason not to. If stories like this remind you that kindness still exists in this world, take a second to subscribe. Join our family where every story is a reminder that one act of goodness can change a life, a family, and sometimes generations. Now, let's continue. He wrote about a medic who saved his life during an ambush near the Arghandab River. He said if it weren't for that man, he wouldn't have made it home for Christmas that year. Daniel's throat tightened. He remembered that day clearly now, remembered pulling a young soldier back from the edge of death. He talked about you constantly, Margaret continued, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Doc Cole, he called you, said you were the calmest man he'd ever seen under fire, said you talked to him the whole time, kept him conscious, kept him fighting. Daniel sat in stunned silence, the past and present colliding in ways he had never imagined possible. He had saved countless soldiers during his service, faces blurring together over time, but something about hearing his own nickname spoken back to him, 12 years later, in a stranger's kitchen, made the memory suddenly, achingly vivid. Is David? Daniel started, then stopped, uncertain how to finish a question that already felt dangerous, already felt like it might shatter something fragile. Margaret's face answered before her words did, a familiar heaviness settling over her features, the specific exhaustion of grief that never fully leaves a person's body. He came home from his second tour, she said softly. He was fine, physically, but something in him had changed. 3 years ago, the nightmares got worse. He struggled to find his footing back in civilian life. Daniel felt his stomach drop, recognizing the story before she finished telling it. He died 18 months ago, Margaret said finally, the words falling like stones into the quiet kitchen. The department called it an accident, but I know better. I've always known better. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the weight of what she had just told him. He knew that particular silence, the unspoken truth families carried when a soldier survived the war only to lose the peace afterward. He thought of his own nightmares, his own unraveling, the house with the green door, the wife who tried and failed to hold him together. He understood exactly what Margaret was describing. I'm sorry, Daniel said, the words feeling insufficient against the size of her loss, yet true nonetheless. Margaret nodded, accepting the condolence the way she had learned to accept all condolences, gracefully, but with visible strain beneath the surface. You gave me 4 more years with him, she said, looking directly at Daniel now. 4 years I wouldn't have had otherwise. Whatever happened afterward, whatever demons followed him home, you gave our family that time. I've wanted to thank the man in David's letters for years. I never imagined he'd be standing in my kitchen returning my wallet. Daniel did not know what to say to that, how to hold both truths at once, the pride of having saved a young soldier's life, and the grief of learning that life had ended anyway, quietly, painfully, far from any battlefield. He thought about his own struggle, the years of silence, the slow collapse of everything he had built after coming home. I know what he went through, Daniel said quietly. I went through something similar myself. It's why He gestured vaguely at his worn jacket, his torn boots, the visible evidence of everything he had lost. Margaret studied him for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes, calculation and compassion working together toward a decision. How long have you been without a home? She asked gently, no judgment in her tone, only genuine concern. Daniel exhaled slowly. Going on 3 years now. Lost the job first, then the house, then most everything else that mattered. He said it plainly, without self-pity, the way a man states facts he has made peace with, even if peace had cost him nearly everything he once believed made a life worth living. 3 years, Margaret repeated, almost to herself, calculating something Daniel could not yet see. She stood and walked to the window, looking out over her manicured backyard, the kind of quiet wealth that had never fully protected her from grief. David wrote about you like you were the reason he still believed in good men, she said without turning around. I spent 18 months wondering what I could have done differently, wondering if there was anyone left from his service who might help me understand what he carried home with him. And now you're sitting in my kitchen. I don't know if I can explain what he carried, Daniel admitted honestly. War does something to a person that's hard to put into words, even for the ones who lived it. But I can tell you he was brave, braver than most men I served with. He never left anyone behind, never hesitated when it mattered. Margaret turned back toward him, tears standing fresh in her eyes again, though her expression had shifted, something like resolve settling into her posture. Would you be willing to tell me more, she asked, about him, about what happened over there? They talked for nearly 2 hours, the eggs growing cold and forgotten between them, replaced by stories neither had spoken aloud in years. Daniel described the ambush near the river, the chaos, the fear, and the strange calm that settled over him whenever lives depended on his steady hands. Margaret listened intently, filling gaps her son's letters had left unfinished, understanding finally the full weight of what David had survived and what he had ultimately been unable to outrun. For the first time in 18 months, her grief felt less like a locked room and more like a door someone had finally opened. You saved him once, Margaret said eventually, her voice steadier now, resolved. I couldn't save him the second time, no matter how hard I tried. But maybe I can do something for the man who tried to save him first. Daniel shook his head instinctively, the old pride resurfacing. I didn't return your wallet expecting anything, Mrs. Whitfield. I did it because it was right. Margaret smiled faintly, the first real smile Daniel had seen cross her face since he arrived. I know that. That's exactly why I intend to help you, whether you're comfortable with it or not. Margaret explained that her foundation, established originally for arts education, had recently expanded its mission after David's death, quietly funding mental health resources for returning veterans. She had struggled, she admitted, to find the right direction for the initiative, uncertain how to reach the men and women who needed it most. The ones like David who slipped through cracks in a system too overwhelmed to catch everyone. I've been searching for someone who understands this from the inside, she said. Someone veterans would trust. I think, perhaps, the universe just answered a question I didn't know how to ask. Daniel felt something shift inside his chest, a sensation he had not experienced in years, something dangerously close to hope. He had grown suspicious of hope, having watched it disappoint him repeatedly since coming home from war. I'm not sure I'm the right person, he said carefully. I've been on the street for 3 years, Mrs. Whitfield. I haven't exactly been managing my own life well. Margaret shook her head firmly. You returned a stranger's wallet with nearly $1,000 inside it when you had $11 in your pocket. I'd say your judgment is intact. What you need is a chance. A chance to do what, exactly? Daniel asked, still cautious, still bracing for the disappointment he had learned to expect from good intentions. Margaret leaned forward, her expression earnest. I want to build a program specifically for veterans transitioning out of homelessness. Real housing, real counseling, real jobs, not just temporary shelters that expire after 90 days. I have the resources. What I don't have is someone who understands the walk from the inside, someone veterans will actually listen to. You lived what David lived. That matters more than any credential I could hire for this position. Daniel sat with the offer for a long moment, turning it over carefully, searching for the catch he had learned to expect from strangers offering something for nothing. But Margaret's eyes held only sincerity, the particular honesty of someone whose grief had stripped away all patience for pretense. I'd need somewhere to start, he said finally, testing the idea aloud. Somewhere to sleep that isn't concrete. Some time to get my bearings again. Margaret nodded immediately. There's a guest house behind the property. It's yours for as long as you need it. Consider it step 1, not charity. Step 1 of what? Daniel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer forming in Margaret's determined expression. Step 1 of honoring my son properly, she said. Not with a plaque or a scholarship nobody remembers, but with something real, something that might have saved him if it existed 3 years ago. I want to call it the Whitfield Veterans Initiative, and I want you helping me build it, from the ground up, because you understand things about this work that I never could, no matter how much money or how many meetings I dedicate to it. Daniel looked down at his weathered hands, hands that had once stopped bleeding wounds under enemy fire, hands that had spent 3 years holding cardboard signs beneath a highway overpass. Something in Margaret's offer felt larger than charity, larger even than opportunity. It felt like purpose, the specific kind he had been missing since the day his rifle was returned to an armory, and no one told him what to do with the rest of his life. "All right," he said quietly, testing how the word felt in his mouth after years of expecting nothing. "I'll help you build it." Margaret extended her hand across the counter, and Daniel shook it firmly, the gesture feeling more significant than a simple handshake typically warranted. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, weak sunlight breaking through gray clouds and spilling across the kitchen floor. Margaret glanced toward David's photograph on the counter, something like peace settling briefly across her face for the first time in 18 months. "He would have liked this," she said quietly, knowing his doc found his mother. Of all the sidewalks in this city, Daniel followed her gaze toward the photograph and allowed himself a small, cautious smile. The guest house behind Margaret's property was small but warm, a single bedroom with a fireplace and a kitchenette overlooking the garden. Daniel stood in the doorway that first evening, uncertain how to occupy a space that felt too generous, too permanent, after years of temporary shelters and concrete overpasses. He set his backpack down carefully, the same backpack that had carried everything he owned for 3 years, and sat on the edge of the bed, running his hand across clean sheets that smelled faintly of lavender. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Daniel slept through the night. The following weeks moved quickly, filled with meetings Daniel had never expected to attend, conversations with contractors, city officials, and veteran service organizations, eager to partner with the newly announced Whitfield Veterans Initiative. Margaret handled the financial architecture while Daniel focused on something equally important, understanding what veterans actually needed versus what well-meaning donors assumed they needed. He insisted on private counseling rooms rather than open group therapy for those who weren't ready to speak aloud. He insisted on job training programs that respected a veteran's existing skills rather than starting everyone from zero. Margaret listened to every suggestion carefully. Word spread slowly at first, then quickly, through veteran networks and social workers familiar with the gaps in existing services. Men and women began arriving at the newly renovated building on Liberty Street, some skeptical, some desperate, all searching for something the system had repeatedly failed to provide them. Daniel greeted each person personally, understanding immediately the particular exhaustion behind their eyes, the specific weight of carrying battles nobody else could see. He never lectured, never pretended expertise he did not possess. He simply listened, the way he wished someone had listened to him during his own darkest years. One evening, 3 months into the program, a young woman named Sarah Mitchell arrived at Daniel's office, her hands trembling as she described leaving the Marines after 2 deployments, unable to hold a job for longer than a few weeks at a time. Daniel recognized the pattern immediately, the restlessness, the difficulty trusting stability after years of expecting chaos. He did not offer easy solutions or empty encouragement. Instead, he told her honestly about his own collapse, his own 3 years on the street, and the slow, difficult process of finding solid ground again. Sarah left that evening with an appointment and something resembling hope. Margaret watched Daniel transform over those months, the weathered exhaustion in his posture gradually replaced by something closer to purpose. She often found him in the office late in the evening, reviewing case files, calling contacts he had made during his service, building a network of support that extended far beyond anything a traditional nonprofit typically achieved. "You're working too hard," she told him one night, finding him still at his desk past 9. Daniel looked up and smiled faintly. "I spent 3 years doing nothing that mattered, Mrs. Whitfield. I've got time to make up for." "Call me Margaret," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "You've earned that much at least." Daniel nodded, allowing himself the small familiarity. Their relationship had shifted gradually from stranger to something closer to family, an unlikely bond forged through shared grief and a shared understanding of what war takes from those who survive it. Margaret often thought of David during these late conversations, wondering whether a program like this might have reached him in time, might have caught him before he slipped through the cracks that swallowed too many veterans every single year. The Whitfield Veterans Initiative expanded faster than either of them anticipated, additional funding arriving from corporate partners impressed by the program's early success rates. Within 6 months, they had housed 31 veterans, connected 47 others to counseling services, and placed 19 individuals in stable employment, matching their skills and interests. Local news outlets began requesting interviews, curious about the unconventional origin story behind the program's success, a homeless veteran and a grieving mother building something meaningful from an ordinary act of honesty on a rain-soaked sidewalk. Daniel remained hesitant about publicity, uncomfortable with attention he had not sought. "They want to interview you specifically," Margaret told him one afternoon, holding a request from a national morning show, eager to feature the story. Daniel shook his head immediately, old instincts resurfacing. "I'm not interested in being some feel-good segment between weather reports and celebrity gossip." Margaret understood his hesitation, but pressed gently anyway. "Think about how many veterans might see it, Daniel. How many might recognize themselves in your story and finally ask for help? This isn't about you being comfortable. It's about reaching the people still sitting under overpasses tonight, wondering if anyone remembers they exist." Daniel sat with that argument for several days, weighing his discomfort against the potential reach of a national audience. He thought about his own darkest nights, the specific loneliness of believing no one understood what he carried, the shame that kept him from seeking help until circumstances forced his hand. If sharing his story publicly meant even one veteran recognized their own reflection and reached out before reaching a breaking point, the discomfort seemed a small price to pay. He called Margaret that evening and agreed to the interview, though he insisted David's story remained central to it. The interview aired on a Thursday morning, Daniel sitting stiffly beside Margaret in the Whitfield Foundation's newly renovated lobby, describing honestly the wallet, the walk to Crestline Avenue, and the astonishing coincidence that connected his past to Margaret's present grief. He spoke plainly about his own homelessness, refusing to soften the details for comfortable viewing, insisting that veterans watching needed truth rather than a sanitized narrative. Margaret spoke about David, her voice steady despite visible emotion, describing how his sacrifice had ultimately led to a program that might prevent other families from experiencing the same devastating loss she had endured. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Phone lines at the foundation rang continuously for days, veterans from across the country requesting information, family members seeking resources for struggling relatives, donors offering financial support far exceeding anything Margaret had projected. But the messages that affected Daniel most arrived through handwritten letters, veterans describing their own struggles, thanking him for speaking honestly about shame and homelessness without shrinking the reality into something more palatable. One letter in particular, from a young man named Marcus in Ohio, described standing on a bridge 3 nights before Daniel's interview aired, reconsidering everything after watching it. Marcus wrote that he had been prepared to end his life that night, convinced nobody would notice or care if he disappeared entirely. Then he had seen Daniel's interview, heard him describe the exact isolation Marcus felt, the exact conviction that asking for help meant admitting failure. Marcus had called the foundation's hotline instead, connected that same week with a counselor who understood combat trauma firsthand. Daniel read the letter 3 times before setting it down carefully, his hands unsteady, understanding fully for the first time the actual weight and reach of the decision he had made on a rainy sidewalk months earlier. He carried Marcus's letter with him for weeks afterward, folded carefully inside his jacket pocket, a physical reminder of exactly why the discomfort of public attention mattered less than the lives potentially saved by it. Margaret noticed the shift in him, a new steadiness replacing the last remnants of hesitation. "You saved a life you'll probably never meet in person," she told him one evening. Daniel nodded slowly. "Feels different than the war. Over there you see the wound, you see the blood, you know exactly what you're fighting against. This is quieter. But maybe it matters just as much." By the program's first anniversary, the Whitfield Veterans Initiative had expanded into 2 additional cities, funded partly through the foundation's endowment, and partly through donations inspired by Daniel and Margaret's original story. Daniel stood at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new Cleveland location, watching Marcus, now employed as an outreach coordinator, greet arriving veterans with the same steady patience Daniel had once shown him through letters and phone calls. The full circle of it struck Daniel forcefully, a chain of kindness extending far beyond anything he could have imagined while sitting beneath a rain-soaked overpass just over a year before. Sarah Mitchell, The young Marine veteran who had walked into Daniel's office trembling months earlier now managed the initiative's job placement division, having found stable footing after years of restlessness following her own service. She often told newer participants about her first meeting with Daniel, how his honesty about his own collapse had made her own struggles feel survivable rather than shameful. He never pretended he had all the answers, she told them. He just told the truth about how hard it was, and somehow that made it easier to believe things could actually get better eventually, even slowly. Margaret rarely spoke publicly about her grief anymore, having found a way to channel it into something that continued honoring David's memory without consuming her entirely. She kept his photograph on her office desk now, instead of the kitchen counter, a quiet reminder of the reason behind everything they had built together. Some evenings, she and Daniel sat together after the office emptied, discussing expansion plans, reviewing case files, or simply sitting in comfortable silence, two people who understood loss and survival in ways few others around them fully could, bound together by a debt neither could ever fully repay. 2 years after Daniel first knocked on Margaret's door with a wallet in his outstretched hand, the Whitfield Veterans Initiative had grown into one of the most respected veteran support organizations in the country, operating in 7 cities, with over 400 veterans successfully transitioned into stable housing and employment. Daniel served as executive director now, a title that still felt slightly foreign whenever he saw it printed on business cards or building directories. He kept his original cardboard sign in a drawer in his office, a private reminder of exactly where he had started and exactly how far honesty could carry a person. He had reconnected with his ex-wife eventually, not romantically, but with a friendship rebuilt slowly through shared understanding of what those difficult years had cost them both. She had remarried, found stability Daniel could not offer during his darkest period, but she visited occasionally, proud of the man he had rebuilt himself into, proud that something meaningful had emerged from everything they had lost together. Daniel understood now that some relationships survive by ending, that love sometimes looks like letting someone go so they can find peace you could not provide them during your own unraveling and collapse. Margaret often reflected on the specific randomness of that October morning, the fact that her wallet could have fallen anywhere, could have been found by anyone, could have simply vanished into a stranger's pocket without consequence or story. Instead, it had fallen at the feet of the one person in the entire city capable of returning both an object and a piece of her son she believed permanently lost. She had stopped believing in coincidence entirely, choosing instead to believe that some encounters carry a weight too significant to be accidental, regardless of whether faith or chance deserved the credit. Daniel visited David's grave occasionally, standing quietly beside the headstone in Arlington, remembering the young private who had trusted him completely during those chaotic minutes beside the Arghandab River. He often spoke aloud during these visits, updating David on the initiative's progress, on Sarah's promotion, on Marcus's continued outreach work, on the hundreds of veterans who had found stability, partly because David's mother refused to let his sacrifice disappear quietly into grief alone. "We're taking care of them," Daniel told the headstone during one visit, "the way I should have been able to take care of you." The guest house behind Margaret's property remained Daniel's home, though he had slowly transformed it into something reflecting his own personality rather than simply borrowed comfort. Photographs lined the walls now, veterans he had helped, milestones the initiative had reached, and one particular photograph of David that Margaret had given him during their second year working together. "He'd want you to have this one," she had said simply, handing him a photograph of David laughing during basic training, unburdened yet by everything that would eventually follow him home from war. Marcus eventually opened his own satellite office in Columbus, expanding the initiative's reach into rural areas where veteran resources remained particularly scarce. He often called Daniel late at night, discussing difficult cases, seeking advice on situations that mirrored his own darkest period, standing on that bridge years earlier. Daniel always answered, regardless of the hour, understanding intimately the specific danger of a veteran reaching out during their lowest moment and finding no one available to answer. "That's the whole point," he told Marcus once. "Somebody answered for me, eventually, even if it took longer than it should have." Sarah married another veteran she had met through the program, a quiet, steady man named James, who had struggled with his own transition after 8 long years in the Navy. Daniel attended their wedding, standing near the back of the small ceremony, watching two people who had each nearly given up on themselves entirely build something steady and lasting together. Proof that the same war that broke people could not stop them from finding tenderness again, if given enough patience. Margaret sat beside him, tears standing in her eyes throughout the ceremony, the particular joy of witnessing healing she had helped make possible for others, even while continuing to navigate her own permanent, complicated grief regarding David's absence from moments like these. The initiative's 5th anniversary celebration filled an entire ballroom downtown. Hundreds of veterans, donors, and staff members gathering to commemorate 5 years of measurable, meaningful impact. Daniel stood at the podium, uncomfortable as always with public speaking, but steady now in ways he had not been during that first television interview years earlier. He spoke briefly about David, about Margaret's courage in transforming grief into purpose, and about the countless veterans whose names rarely made headlines, but whose lives had been fundamentally altered by a simple, foundational belief that honesty and dignity still mattered, even for those the world had forgotten. After the speeches concluded, Daniel found himself standing near the ballroom's large windows, looking out over the city that had once been indifferent to his existence. The same streets he had once walked with $11 folded into his sock and nowhere particular to sleep. Margaret joined him quietly, following his gaze toward the darkened skyline. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked. "About what would have happened if you'd kept the money instead?" Daniel considered the question seriously before answering. "I think about it sometimes. But I already knew who I was before I found that wallet." "The wallet didn't make me honest," Daniel continued, his voice quiet but certain. "It just gave me the chance to prove it to myself again, at a moment when I desperately needed reminding that I hadn't lost everything worth keeping." Margaret nodded slowly, understanding the distinction he was drawing, the difference between circumstances creating character and circumstances simply revealing character already present beneath difficult surface conditions. "David used to say something similar," she said softly, "that the war didn't make him brave. It just showed him he already was, long before anyone handed him a rifle and a uniform." Winter arrived again, the 5th winter since Daniel had first walked 12 blocks with a stranger's wallet pressed against his ribs. He no longer feared the cold the way he once had, no longer measured survival in dollars folded into socks or blankets salvaged from donation bins. He had a home now, purpose, and a community of veterans who understood without explanation exactly what he had carried home from war and exactly what it had cost him to set that weight down eventually. Some nights, he still thought about the overpass on 3rd Street, not with regret, but with quiet gratitude for the man he had remained. The initiative received a letter one December morning from a veteran named Robert Hale, describing his own recovery after connecting with the Cleveland office 2 years earlier. Robert had been sleeping in his car when a caseworker first reached him, skeptical and defensive after years of failed promises from various programs claiming to help. He wrote that what changed his mind was learning the organization's origin story, a homeless veteran who had chosen honesty over desperation, proving through his own actions that dignity and struggle could coexist within the same person. Robert now worked as a mechanic, stable and steady for the first time in years. Daniel kept every letter like Robert's in a growing collection, stored carefully in a filing cabinet beside his original cardboard sign, a physical archive of exactly how far one honest decision had traveled through countless interconnected lives. He rarely reread them, knowing the collection existed less for his own comfort and more as proof, tangible evidence he could point toward whenever doubt crept in during difficult board meetings or funding shortfalls. Margaret often reminded him, during those harder moments, that impact rarely announces itself loudly or immediately. Sometimes it simply accumulates quietly, letter by letter, life by life, until the weight becomes undeniable. On the 5th anniversary of David's death, Daniel and Margaret visited Arlington together, standing side by side before the familiar headstone, the cold air sharp against their faces. Margaret placed fresh flowers at the base while Daniel stood quietly, remembering the young private who had trusted him completely during chaos. Neither of them had chosen, but both had survived, at least for a while. "He'd be proud of what we built," Margaret said softly. Daniel nodded, watching wind move gently through the surrounding trees. He already gave us everything we needed to build it. We just finally listened close enough to hear it. Years later, historians studying the modern veteran homelessness crisis would frequently reference the Whitfield Veterans Initiative as a model program, praising its emphasis on dignity, individualized care, and community trust building rather than generic institutional processing. Few of those academic papers captured the origin story fully, the specific rainy morning, the specific wallet, the specific choice one exhausted, hungry man made when he could have easily justified keeping what desperation might have excused. Daniel never minded the omission. The statistics mattered more to him than the recognition, the actual lives rebuilt mattering infinitely more than any acknowledgement of the story's dramatic beginnings. Daniel eventually trained new outreach coordinators personally, insisting each one spend time actually living the experience they were meant to address, walking alongside veterans currently sleeping rough, listening rather than lecturing, understanding rather than assuming. You cannot fix what you refuse to fully see, he told every new hire during orientation. And you cannot see clearly from behind a desk, no matter how many reports you read or statistics you memorize. His approach, unconventional by traditional nonprofit standards, produced results that traditional approaches had consistently failed to achieve for decades. Proof that genuine understanding mattered more than institutional credentials alone. Margaret eventually stepped back from daily operations, trusting Daniel and the team he had built to continue the work without her constant oversight, though she remained deeply invested emotionally in every milestone the initiative achieved. She spent more time now with her grandchildren, David's memory present in quieter, gentler ways than the raw grief that had once defined her every waking moment. The Foundation's work had not erased her loss. Nothing ever fully would. But it had given that loss somewhere meaningful to live, transformed into something that continued protecting other families from experiencing the exact devastation hers had endured years earlier. Daniel still walked past the overpass on 3rd Street occasionally, though rarely by accident anymore. He kept a folder in his car now, resources and information for anyone he encountered sleeping there, the same information nobody had offered him during his own darkest years. He never lectured the men and women he found, never assumed their circumstances mirrored his own exactly. He simply sat beside them sometimes, shared a meal when possible, and reminded them gently that dignity remained theirs to keep, regardless of circumstance, regardless of how thoroughly the world outside seemed to have forgotten they existed at all. Daniel never considered himself extraordinary for returning that wallet on a cold October morning. He simply chose to remain the man he had always been, even when hunger, pain, and desperation gave him every excuse to become someone else. Because in the end, the true measure of a person's character is not what they gain when life is easy, but what they refuse to lose when life becomes hard. And perhaps that's the lesson our world needs now more than ever. We live in a time where kindness is often mistaken for weakness, where honesty is becoming rare, where greed, violence, hatred, betrayal, kidnapping, and senseless killing seem to make more headlines than compassion. But imagine a different world, a world where more people chose to be like Daniel, choosing integrity when no one was watching. A world with more people like Margaret, people who never forget a good deed and who believe that kindness should always be rewarded. If more hearts chose what is right instead of what is easy, families would stay together, communities would become safer, strangers would become neighbors, and this world would know far more love, peace, and unity than fear. Real change doesn't always begin with presidents or governments. Sometimes, it begins with one honest decision, one act of kindness, one person refusing to stop being good. Now we'd love to hear from you. If you were Daniel, hungry, homeless, with only $11 to your name, would you have returned that wallet or would you have kept it? Tell us honestly in the comments. There is no judgment here. We want to hear your heart. And what moment in this story touched you the most? We'd also love to know where you're watching from. Our family is growing across the world, and it's always inspiring to see how far these stories travel. If stories like this remind you that goodness still exists, if you believe this world needs more compassion, more honesty, and more people willing to do the right thing, then become part of our family. Subscribe to Quiet Mercies, where every story reminds us that ordinary acts of kindness can change extraordinary lives. Like this video so more people can discover this message. Share it with someone you love, because one story can change one heart. And one changed heart can help change the world. Until our next story, keep choosing kindness, keep believing in goodness, and never underestimate the power of doing what is right. Because sometimes, one simple act of honesty can echo through generations.